Well, welcome everyone once again to our Sunday school class on the moral law and its understanding in regards to a love language for the God that we worship each Sunday morning. We're looking at the fourth commandment, which is to honor the Sabbath day. And the first thing we noted last week as we introduced this lesson was that it also implicitly deals with the topic of work. And so all of last week's lesson concerned that. I want to highlight a few points from last week, but I'm going to begin by reading the text once again. You'll see it on the screen. Exodus 20, beginning at verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy. And as I said earlier, we spent some time dealing with the topic of work last week. Verse 9, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. And so we studied that a little bit as it related to the cultural mandate in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and that mankind was commissioned to subdue the earth. And we talked about that as a calling on each person's life, that there isn't a more holier or sanctified job, that all of life, regardless what your position is, what your calling is, whether it is a homemaker, a shopkeeper, a business owner, a doctor, a lawyer, or someone that even just rake leaves or is a handyman, all of these jobs are callings of the Lord. And we are to learn what that giftedness is in our own life and then try to develop it as best we can so that what we produce with our hands as well as our mind is something that offers God a worship. And we're looking for here the excellence of Christ in what we do, not perfectionism. That would lead us into pride. But we want to honor God with what it is that we do and produce. So we talked about that in a variety of different ways last week. And so today we're moving on into the whole topic of rest, which is what most people think of when you come to this commandment. Now the material for this particular lesson is extensive, so I'm going to be doing this over 2 weeks. I'll have this recording today, and then also when I return, we'll be handling it some more. And I think that will be good because there's going to be some questions that come up with the material that we'll be looking at. I want to note here that God is serious about this commandment. It's an ordinance, and it is something that God takes very seriously. It is accompanied by a capital punishment for disobedience. Killing, adultery, and theft are all acts that would seem to merit capital punishment, and we see that within the law and other places that was given to Israel. But it seems like the Sabbath would be a small matter, that it wouldn't be attached to a capital offense, but nonetheless, it is. Just ask the wood gatherer of Numbers chapter 15, verse 32 through 35. Let me read it for you. I do not have this on the screen. Just listen. Now, while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. And they put him in custody because it had been declared what should be done to him. Hadn't been declared at this time. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." And again, we come across this in Exodus chapter 31, beginning at verse 14. "Therefore you are to observe the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. And again, in chapter 35 of Exodus, beginning at verse 2, it's reiterated once again. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a holy day, a Sabbath of complete rest to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall not kindle a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. So it's quite specific here that you're not even to be going out and getting kindling wood for the purpose of having a fire. It's pretty extensive, and the rules and regulations on this are massive as well. Now, for some commentators, this commandment is a readdressing of the creation ordinance that's initially given in Genesis. Let's pick that up. I'll read it for you. Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. And by the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. However, what we need to note on this passage is this, that the seventh day rest here is completely focused upon God in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. There's no mention of humanity here. The humanity part comes in much later in what instructions are actually be given to the nation of Israel. We also note on this that there is no evidence whatsoever that the Sabbath was observed by Israel before being commanded to do so in the Decalogue. Decalogue, moral law, these are synonyms for the Ten Commandments. You'll note here that if we go back into the ancient people groups, including Noah and the patriarchs, beginning with Abraham, mention many things during those time periods. There's things mentioned about prayer, there's things mentioned about sacrifices, even circumcision, but there's no Sabbath keeping. The only reference to a prelude in advance of the fourth commandment, we have it in Exodus 16, 23 to 29, verses 23 and 29. Then he said to them, "This is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left put aside and keep until morning. See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you bread for 2 days on the sixth day. Remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day." So let's talk about this whole subject of rest and this particular day as it relates to modern day culture. Again, some findings from the book, The Day America Told the Truth. The findings here said that 77% of the people that were polled said that they didn't see the point of observing the Sabbath. There's no value in it. This isn't surprising given the fact that most Christians do not understand the significance of it either. Ask most Christians and they're pretty laissez-faire about this. When I was young, and most of you that are older, around my age or older, you might remember that stores were basically closed on Sundays. That is not the case now. People, including Christians, fail to see the Sabbath portion of the Decalogue displays God's authority over something that we as humans value very, very much, which is our time. We value it greatly. And this is the one commandment out of 10 which addresses this essential commodity that we have, and we are very possessive over of how we're going to use our time. It's the most sacred of all of our supposed possessions. From the book Celebrate the Sabbath by Bruce Ray, he writes on this: because all time is God's time, He has authority over our use of time. We are only stewards of God's time, and He commands a weekly cycle of work and rest. Here is the offense of the Sabbath commandment. Ever since the fall, when Adam and Eve declared their independence from God, everyone descending from our first parents has a deeply resented God's claim over our time as human beings. We think time is ours to use as we please, and we do not respect the rule of the eternal over the temporal. I think that's largely true. I mean, a lot of people, you start talking about my time, even as it relates to the Sabbath, Sunday, it's an issue. So let's move on further here in defining what is the Sabbath. The Hebrew here is Shabbat. Shabbat. It means an intermission. It means to make rest. In Genesis chapter 2, 1-3, God sets apart the seventh day from the other six. From a Jewish perspective, the Sabbath ran from Friday night sundown till Saturday evening sundown. And this was the high point of the week. And I really think a real value that Christians should see this in this light. The weekly routine for an Israelite ran like this. For 3 days, the Jews would look with expectation to worship in the synagogue or at the tabernacle. They're going to go. This is the direction they're going to go. The expectancy is growing with each of those days. Then they have the Sabbath, and after that, the following 3 days were ones of reflection on the worship event and the hearing of God's word. So that instead of seeing Sunday or the Sabbath as the end of the week, it's almost like it's the middle of the week. It's 3 days of expectation of where we're going, what we're going to be hearing, how we're going to be understanding God's word to us. And then we have that time of rest and that focus. And then the following 3 days is reflecting on what did we learn? Where do we need to grow? And the cycle then begins. The Sabbath was a pivotal part of the week, which helped give meaning to the other 6 days. Now, the New Testament controversy on this concerns the idea, should it be observed? Why is it that you find such diversity about this within the Christian church? I mean, there's not too much diversity about adultery being wrong, for example, or stealing, right? Or murder. But when it comes to the Sabbath, there is some ambiguity here, given the fact that people don't want anyone telling them what to do with their time. Even if we set that aside, there still is this idea that should it be observed? What's the New Testament position on it? Well, we first note this, that the fourth commandment is the only part of the moral law not to be restated in the New Testament. In other words, all of the other parts of the law, regarding adultery or honor your mother and father or stealing, coveting, etc., all of these commandments, and also the first 3 that we've already covered, are restated in some way, shape, or form in the New Testament, and in many places, many, many times over, they're restated. But that is not the case with the Sabbath. There's no instruction on it within the New Testament. And when it comes up, the topic of it does come up, but it tends to have the understanding of our rest in Christ is a Sabbath. I'll explain that in a minute. Some see an implied endorsement of Jesus on the Sabbath. Let me give you this. This comes from Robert Shaw in his exposition of the Westminster Confession of Faith. He's noting the remarks of Jesus here in the Olivet Discourse when he says to people getting close to the judgment upon the nation of Israel in Matthew chapter 24. He says there, pray that your flight may not be in winter. You might remember this text. Or neither on the Sabbath day, the passage reads, Matthew 24, verse 20. Shaw writes on this. He says, Christ is there speaking not of the Jewish, but of the Christian Sabbath. For he refers to a flight which should happen at the destruction of Jerusalem, and this did not take place until 40 years after the Jewish Sabbath was abolished. But though the Sabbath was then to be changed from the seventh day to the first day of the week, yet the words of Christ certainly intimate that the Sabbath was to be continued. I think it's an interesting insight that he gives here. So that Jesus is saying, thinking about the destruction of the temple later, which would happen 40 years later when he's giving this instruction in Matthew chapter 24, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. So there's a presupposition there, or it's implied that you're going to be observing that. Pray that it doesn't happen on that day so that you don't have to run and be engaged in work to save your life. However, I also note that all of the instruction concerning the Sabbath is found also in the ceremonial law. Now, you might remember I was at pains on this in regards to the introduction to this class, noting that there are different forms of law that are given there. That there is the moral law, which we are covering in this class, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. There is the ceremonial law, which are all the laws that related to the tabernacle and the high priests and their function there, their responsibilities, the offerings, things to be offered, the holidays that they'd be observing, etc., all part of the ceremonial law. And the third part is the case law, or the general law that was given to the nation of Israel to administrate itself. All of those laws emanate from the Ten Commandments, but they're specifically given to the nation of Israel. And I note on that there were more than 30 different capital offenses for breaking those laws, including adultery or stealing, that could involve one's life being taken. They were given directly to the nation of Israel. And as I remarked in the introductory classes, the ceremonial was completely fulfilled in Christ when his work was done on the cross, and the laws given to the nation of Israel were done away with because the nation no longer exists. That was a theocracy with God as the authority over the nation. The ceremonial and the civil laws are not repeated in the New Testament, but every single one of the Ten Commandments is revisited in one way or another, and many times, except the Fourth Commandment. In addition, the Fourth Commandment may indeed not be even part of the moral law. This is another insight that's out there. If we note here that within the first two chapters of the book of Romans, Paul argues that the law was written on the conscience and on the tablets of stone in one way or another within the centerpiece of man's soul. We've highlighted that, and I have highlighted that many times in various classes, that no matter where you go around the globe, you find evidence of the moral law. Being obedient to parents is universal. Adultery and it being a negative thing is universal. Stealing, etc. It goes on. All of those that are there. But even though it's universal, and Paul appeals to this in Romans chapter 1, we don't find this as evidence in regards to the Sabbath. The Sabbath is unique among the Ten Commandments. It is not, I would maintain, stamped on the human conscience because of creation. Rather, it is an ordinance like circumcision for the redeemed community. Pagans know that setting up idols in the place of God is wrong, but do it anyway. It's difficult to find a universal principle for the Sabbath. It can be argued as useful and practical, justified, and particularly in cultures that have already had religious traditions of observing the Lord's Day. But one would be hard-pressed to simply take a native from the South Pacific and ask him or her to come up with anything equivalent to the Jewish Sabbath. Michael Horton is writing on this. He says, that is because it is the only commandment of the 10 that is not given to all the people by way of creation, but it is a special gift for the people of God, pointing them in a unique way to the coming of the Messiah. So we have to note this, that it is part of the Decalogue here, and it is included, but all of the instruction of it comes in the ceremonial law. This is where some of this ambiguity comes into play, like, how is it to be observed, and in what way is it to be observed? I note here that there is not a single command in the New Testament concerning the Sabbath. You'll see it on the screen, that believers are commanded to regularly meet together. We have that in Hebrews 10, verse 25. Not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. In other words, we're supposed to be coming together for the purpose of worship and encouragement and also hearing of the Word of God. But there's nothing here said about the Sabbath. Secondly, we note here that the meeting was recognized on the first day of the week. There's a transition here. In other words, it moves from Saturday, the Shabbat, to Sunday, the first day of the week. We have it in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. And on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to leave the next day, and he prolonged his message until midnight. I'm calling your attention there to the reference of the first day. Again, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. And on the first day of the week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come. So just an idea there of the offering. The great Princeton theologian B.B. Warfield remarked, he said, Christ took the Sabbath into the grave and with him, and brought the Lord's Day out of the grave with the resurrection on the morning, which is an interesting concept. He goes in with the Sabbath and comes up with the resurrection day of Sunday. So the heart of this commandment was fulfilled in Christ. It is fulfilled when a new believer enters into the rest that the final work of Christ accomplished on the cross. Now, I'm going to deal with several passages from the book of Hebrews. The writer is at pains to show this. And what I'm trying to get you to understand is that, hopefully I can make this clear, that the rest that the Hebrews writer is talking about as it relates to the Sabbath is a rest that we have in Christ. That is, we no longer are working to maintain or attain or maintain our position before God based on our own works. As we've noted in the past, it is the work of Christ which guarantees our position before God, not our own. So, the Hebrews writer, first of all, clearly establishes the priority of Christ over Moses. Hebrews chapter 3, beginning at verses 5 and 6. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are if we hold fast to our confidence and the boast that our hope is firm until the end. I'm noting there that the Hebrews writer is just simply saying, Christ is superior to Moses. It's one of the themes of the book of Hebrews, that he's superior to the patriarchs. He's superior to angels. He's superior to Moses. And then he picks up on this. I'm reading selected portions of chapter 4 of Hebrews. He writes this way. He says, "For indeed we have had good news preached to us, just as they also. But the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard it. Remember, he's writing to Jewish believers who are being tempted to leave the church and head back into Judaism. Verse 3, For we who have believed enter that rest. Note the word. Just as he said, As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, I love the reading here. He said somewhere, there's no reference here, but he's quoting from the Old Testament, but he doesn't give the reference. For he said, it says somewhere that concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. So we definitely have the creation ordinance here. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter into it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Notice the language here. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. So as God rested from his work in the creation account, we now rest in Christ. Christ is our Sabbath, and we rest from our work. We're not trying to establish our righteousness before him. But again, remember, the Hebrews writer is writing in a Jewish context. These are people who are Jewish by descent. They were followers of Judaism. They've acknowledged Christ, but now they're being tempted to go back. And the theme of the book is basically, what are you doing? What is there to go back to? You're going back into this idea of a non-restful state. We have this rest that's in Christ because it is guaranteed by Jesus' works and not our imperfect works. Believers, both in the wilderness and believers today, have the same gospel preached to them. It's the same good news, and we apprehend it by faith. Again, chapter 2 of the same book, beginning at verse 8. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. For in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subject to him. He's showing the superiority of Christ here. But now we do not yet see all things subjected to him, but we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and through whom all things are made, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. End quote. Selected portions of chapter 2. Everyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did. You have to understand this. This is what makes the gospel the gospel. This is the good news. You can't work enough to enter into God's grace. Even if you could, you couldn't overcome all of the sin that's still in your life. The whole idea of do good to be good doesn't work. So the beautiful thing about the gospel is we now enter a rest in Christ because of his work, which is done. So the Hebrews writer is saying to these Jews, why in the world would you want to go back? You want to go back to the same kinds of labor that you had in the past, which wouldn't obtain to anything. Now, Paul picks up on this in Romans chapter 4, verse 5. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. We don't do any work. Our works do not justify us. They follow us and they indicate God's hand in our life. They confirm the work of the Spirit, but they do not earn the favor of the Spirit. And that's what he's after right here. Listen to Jesus on this point. Matthew chapter 11, beginning at verse 28. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you, note the word, rest. That's what the Sabbath was all about. It was about a rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. And here it is. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He's speaking of the burden of the law, subjection, and not cares of this life. Okay, he's not talking here about just things in the world that seem to be difficult. He's talking about trying to earn, like trying to do it God's way. Well, we can't. No matter how hard we try. This was the whole thing that drove Luther insane to the point of questioning everything in his life. There's no amount of confession he could possibly do, no amount of works. He couldn't put it together until he realized the righteousness that we have is a righteousness that's imputed to us from Christ. It's put upon us. We don't earn it. We don't do anything to earn it. We don't do anything to maintain it. It's something guaranteed by Him. This is the rest, I think, that was typed in the Sabbath that was given to Israel. We bring that forward and we see how that rest is fulfilled in the work of Christ. Again, Paul to Rome, chapter 5, verse 1. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace, which could also read rest with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. In addition, Paul in the New Testament warns us against coming under legalism for obeying the observation of special days, which includes the Sabbath, which is interesting here. I'm reading Colossians chapter 2, beginning at verse 16. Therefore, let no one act as your judge in regard to food or drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day. Things which are mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So the Sabbath day here is placed alongside other rituals and celebrations in the ceremonial law. Now, those Christians who are Sabbatarians, these are people that strictly observe the Sabbath now. Now, again, they don't do it because they're trying to earn their salvation. They believe everything that I've just taught you, but they believe that the Sabbath regulations of the Old Testament carry forward, and so they're known as Sabbatarians. And they would point out on this that the problem at Colossae was not the Sabbath observance, but rather the attachment of the supernatural power of angels to observe this high holy day. So they kind of see a difference on that. I note, though, that Calvin was anti-Sabbatarian, but he still gave weight to the practice in the church. Philip Hughes summarizes Calvin on this point. He writes, Calvin's Institutes on the Christian religion state, for because it was expedient to overthrow superstition, the day sacred to the Jews was set aside because it was necessary to maintain decorum, order, and peace in the church. Another was appointed for that purpose. He then concludes, for those of them who cling to their constitutions surpass the Jews 3 times over in a crass, carnal, Sabbatarian superstition. It is clear from this passage that for Calvin, the Christian Sunday is not a simple continuation of the Jewish Sabbath, changed into the first day of the week, but a distinctively Christian institution adopted on the abrogation of the former one as a means of the church for order and spiritual health. Calvin's position is really anti-Sabbatarian. So I'm kind of leading up in this way of just trying to show that it isn't a regulation of the Word of God that it be observed to the extent that it was in the Old Testament, and that ultimately, as a point of the law, particularly in the ceremonial law, it actually is fulfilled in Christ. There is no doubt by the Lord Christ's coming that the ceremonial part of this commandment was abolished. For he himself is the truth, with whose presence all figures vanish. He is the body at whose appearance the shadows are left behind. He is, I say, the true fulfillment of the Sabbath. This is Patrick Miller in his book on the Ten Commandments. He continues, he says, although the Sabbath has been abrogated, there is still an occasion for us. One, to assemble on stated days for the hearing of the word and the breaking of the mystical bread and for public prayers. To give of our labor to servants and workmen. There is no doubt that in enjoining the Sabbath, the Lord was concerned with both. Who can deny that these two things apply much to us as it did to the Jews? So what I'm laying out for you at this point, I've introduced the Sabbath to you, and I've also shown that the Sabbath was actually fulfilled in the work of Christ. It's something that we find rest in Him based on His work. So what was given in the Old Testament as a type is then brought forward and realized in the work of Christ. However, what do Christians do about the observance of a holy day 1 and 7? How is that supposed to be worked out? If we're not observing it to the extent that it was in the Old Testament, you don't even get fire for twigs for wood, etc., and there were all these regulations about it. In what sense are we supposed to examine that? So our next class will go into this, because I think there is a point on this that's being thrown out. I think a large part the church has it down with the idea of the Sabbath is fulfilled in Christ, but then it becomes like Sunday is just another day for me to do anything I want to do. I want to build a case the next time we're together to show that's really not it. And we need to look and study a little bit further to understand that, how it's played out. So this is where we will begin, and I will return then. If you have questions, bring them up at that class, because I will be here to answer them. See you then.